Protestantism. Within Protestantism, there is a tendency toward penal substitution. So I think about God primarily as a judge. I think about the human condition primarily as a lawbreaker. And I think about the gospel primarily as Jesus is taking a punishment for my sins to get me off the hook, right? Yeah. Something like that. And yet, if I'm talking to the Eastern Church Fathers, they don't have that concept. They have a very different concept where I am a broken and a dying species, and Christ, who has the life of God in himself, enters our species in order to heal it and repair it. Now let's go to something rather simple. So if you look at the story of, the leper who gets healed by Christ, and then Christ tells him to go and make, a sacrifice or give the offering that, that Moses prescribed as a testimony to them, right? The people who are going to receive this, of his healing, in order to sort of point back toward Christ. If you dig up like what the specific sacrifice that the leper is supposed to offer in this context, it actually involves two birds, and you take one and you kill it, and the blood of the one ends up, going on the other, and then the one that's been bloodied ends up being released. And I know immediately that a Protestant is going to see in that penal substitution. That's their theology, right? They're like, see, this one's Jesus who gets killed. I get doused in the blood, so it looks like I've been killed, and I get let loose and freed, right? But if you look at Cyril of Alexandria, when he looks at that, what he sees is something different. He says, these represent the two natures of Christ, one of which he took on and is subject to death, and one of which is immune to death because it's from heaven and it's divine. And so this is a picture of the two natures of Christ, him being, slain, and yet not dying because, he's divine. And so in this sense, right, the theology that the person has a deep impact on what they see in those, even when they're sticking close to the text. They think they're sticking closer to the text than they maybe are, right? They don't realize how much of their own tradition they're bringing to the text. But it does seem that the sort of story or the sort of theology or the sort of philosophy a person has in their mind will produce a lens, right, or a skew or something like that affects what you see in the story. And so I suppose part of the question is, when it comes to symbology and things like that, do the symbols, I'm not even sure how exactly to formulate the question, because it's almost like a chicken and the egg sort of tension that's there in terms of, is the theology first and then the symbols and the theology, the reciprocal relationship. I trust you get the problem that I'm identifying.
So let's formulate it in a way that's very practical for people to understand. This is the way I like to discuss it, is that I invite two people into my house, right? One of them is someone who is a friend and cares for me. And the other person, I don't know, but the other person is a thief, right? And so these two people enter into my house. And so they will organize my house very differently. That is, the way that they will perceive the structure of my house will be completely different. With all the same facts, with all of the same things there. One of them will be looking at, when other people aren't noticing, what's a way out, is that window locked, and will organize a thief's vision of my house. And that vision will be completely coherent to the purpose of the thief, right? And like I said, like my friend or my family member will have a very different experience of the same house. Now, the question is there a objective hierarchy of worlds? Is there an objective hierarchy of goods in which some worlds yield more reality than others? And that's the biggest question. And so, if you look at, let's say, some of the ideological captured people that we see politically now, their worldview is completely coherent. It has a type of coherence that is, they organize their world in a certain way that yields certain fruits. But I really believe that there is an objective hierarchy of worlds, and there are some worlds and some purposes that yield more reality. And so in terms of Christ, let's say, the penal substitution vision of Christ yields a very, very narrow vision of Christ. And what I've seen in people that embrace that understanding of penal substitution is that they have no cosmology, they have no true ontology, they certainly do not have a metaphysics. And so because of that, they are subject to other patterns without even knowing it, the blinders that we're talking about. And they're in some ways subject to other ontologies and other metaphysics that they don't even know, that are just acting on them without them knowing. Whereas the fullness of Christ, let's say if you have a vision of Christ, I believe that is there in the Orthodox tradition, that's there in the mystical tradition, then that yields an ontology that is Christ-like. It yields everything. Like it yields a metaphysics, it yields an ontology, it yields a morality, it yields a practice, it yields all these things. And therefore it is objectively truer. And so that's the way to, I think, to understand symbolism. And it's not, and so it's not that it in some ways has to do with purpose, right? It has to do with how embedded is your interpretation scheme? How much does it yield? So it's weird because it's kind of like it's almost people say like you're Jonathan, you're postmodern, but it's like you can't actually avoid this. Like I said, because it is true that the thief will live in a different world than you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, so here's the thing. There are two things about what you said that I deeply resonate with that I'd springboard off of, right? One of those is that I just admittedly, as you know, in my approach to philosophy, whenever I would advocate somebody explore a worldview, you have to look at how coherent it is across the scope of reality, right? If it only works within the classroom and then you leave the classroom and you can't live it, it's not a legitimate philosophy, right? Like that is itself an indictment of the philosophy. And so this sort of coherentist structure that says like how coherent is it in terms of the totality of the cosmos, I think is supremely relevant in terms of discerning truth. And I think that's the sort of thing you're identifying when you're talking about this very sort of narrow sliver that makes you susceptible to a host of other things you know, would be problematic. The other thing though, and I think this is really an interesting element, and I didn't anticipate us going here, but I think it's really important, is that there is, I am definitely convinced, and so were the Eastern Church Fathers, that epistemology and ontology are, they are in some ways reciprocal.
Yeah, I totally agree.
And so like one of the things where people, for folks who obviously virtue epistemology is sort of like a contemporary version of this, but I think people can see it in just ordinary ways, right? Like, I don't know, obviously you're an artist, so you know the experience of going from like, I'm a novice, I don't know anything about art, and then I get better at whatever it is, painting, carving, drawing, whatever. And all of a sudden you start to look at other artists and you look at them differently because you're different. And it's like all of a sudden, oh, I didn't realize there were flaws in this guy's work, but now I see like the flaws really clearly. Anybody who's learned an instrument has the same sort of reciprocal experience where it's like, I wanted to learn guitar because I love this riff. And then I learned the riff and I realized it's incredibly simple and maybe it's cool and all, but now I start to appreciate other musicians more because I know something about guitar. Well, according to the church father, and virtue epistemology is basically saying the same thing. Like the more virtuous you become, the clearer you see morality, virtue, and vice. But the Eastern Church Fathers said the same thing, right? This was one of their critiques of the heretics. You are not in a proper epistemic position to actually make judgments about theology, right? Like that was that was one of their indictments of the heretics. And I am inclined to think that in terms of the remedy, right? I was sort of hinting at this is a problem, so how do you remedy it? And on the one hand, we've talked methodology, you stay close to the story and things like that. But it does seem that there's also an aspect of life, right? Like that if, let's just say, for example, the Orthodox Church is, the church, actually entering into the life of the church and the liturgical calendar and, the prayer, a prayer cycle and all these sorts of things and growing in the faith is part of how you begin to cultivate lenses that see the proper patterns as opposed to weird, bizarro, idiosyncratic, self-imposed sort of like eisegesis.
Yeah. I totally agree. And I think that, I haven't had the courage to do this, but my brother, for example, he identified in the Bible like some of the very primal symbols that are there very early. And then he like taught himself to like bake sourdough bread, and then he learned to weave Like he did all of these things that are kind of very basic because he realized that the insight about the meaning of these primal, like, like learn to make fire, like these very primal things can yield more insight by actually practicing them than just thinking about them. Because when you think about them, then you want to jump all these different analogies. But if like if you actually have a fire in front of you and experience it, the insight you'll get is far more real than thinking about fire, you could
Right.
say.
Yeah. No, that's true.
Yeah.
No, that's actually brilliant. I mean, certainly, I think, I mean, anybody who's done the sort of thing where they've studied something and then they went to the place knows what that's like,
Yeah,
right
yeah,
there
for
and then.
sure.